28 of Exodus, God sends the 10 plagues and single-handedly dismantles all of Egypt, Pharaoh's entire economy. In chapter 12, he takes Israel's hand and he walks them right out of Egypt. He walks them across the Red Sea and he provides protection. In Exodus chapter 16, God gives them food. In Exodus chapter 17, he gives them water, and courage and belief to fight the battles. And in Exodus chapter 18, he gives them leadership. Why in the world is God spending all this time on this no-name group of slaves in Egypt? It is because that God has now taken them from their former king in Egypt, and he has proclaimed himself their new king. And in chapter 19, when Israel arrives at Mount Sinai, God takes Moses up the mountain, and he lays down this new law system for his people. If they're going to live under this living God, and he's going to be their king, then there are some things that they're going to have to know. And then we have the list of 10 commandments. Okay, I would reason to believe that most Christians, probably everybody in this room, thinks we should keep the 10 commandments today. Correct or no? Anybody say no? Okay. Of all the ones that were read, which one got the most space? Which one did he taught the longest on? Sabbath. And Clark knew where I was going with that. Sabbath. Really? That one? Well, everything else is pretty self-explanatory, right? Don't murder, honor your father and mother. Those don't need explanations. Do they? I mean, is murder ever okay? I mean, is it okay in war? Is it okay if it's justified? What if somebody breaks into your house and they threaten you? Is it okay to kill them? What about this honoring father and mother stuff? I mean, I get that we should do this kids, but when we get older, we still have to. What if our parents are verbally and physically abusive? Do we still have to honor? You see that there is some gray area here. You guys can hear me okay, right? Okay. There's some gray area that might need some explanation, but we don't get the explanation. Now, if you continue to read and you continue to study and learn more about God, then you realize that you can probably work your way through these things. But the most space we get for these is on the 4th, on the Sabbath. Is it really that important? What are we to do with this law today? I think this is the one that most Christians probably just skip over. God is pretty concerned about the Sabbath. The Hebrew word for Sabbath will appear 45 times in Genesis through Deuteronomy, 14 times in Exodus, 25 times in Leviticus, and 3 each in Numbers and Deuteronomy. Though the Sabbath is often related to Genesis 2, the first time that we actually see the word for Sabbath is in Exodus 16. Fresh out of Egypt, God gives his people food to eat. You guys recall this story? He gives them, what 2 items does he give them for food? Manna and quail. We know what quail is, but manna is this weird kind of peculiar wafer. And the rule is it's going to appear in the morning. And so God says when it shows up, on days 1 through 5, you are to go out and you are to pick the manna. But you're only supposed to pick however much you need, because in the morning, it ain't going to be there. It's going to rot. But on day 6, you are to gather enough for 2 days, because on day 7, it ain't going to be there. So, this is the first idea that you get of something special about the Sabbath. Text says in verse 4 of Exodus 16, they saved it until morning as Moses commanded, and it didn't stink or get maggots in it, talking about the manna. Eat it today, Moses said, because today is a Sabbath to the Lord. You will not find any of it on the ground today. 6 days you are to gather it, but on the 7th day, the Sabbath, there's not going to be any. Nevertheless, some of the people went out on the 7th day to gather it, but they didn't find any. The Lord said to Moses, how long are you going to refuse to keep my commands and my instructions? Bear in mind that the Lord has given you the Sabbath. I'm giving you a break. That is why on the 6th day, he gives you bread for 2 days. Everybody is to stay where they are on the 7th, and nobody's to go out. And so the people rested on the 7th day. So to Israel, the 10 Commandments highlight this sort of God that they're under, and the sort of things that he expects and holds sacred. So, what does that mean for us in regard to a Sabbath day? Are we supposed to keep it or not? Well, we could say that the Sabbath really has no meaning for us. The law was a covenant to Israel only. We're not Israel.
so therefore it doesn't apply to us. That is a point worth talking about. We could say that the point of the Sabbath is an identity marker for the Jews. We're not Jews, so it's not our identity. Also a good point. And we can also say that the Sabbath has ties to the land, and because we don't have the land, it's not something that Christians should worry about. All of these are points that people do talk about, and they're great points. But it's a difficult area of Scripture to wrestle with, given our 24/7 culture. So this morning, I want to attempt to understand the Sabbath more responsibly. And I'm going to use a few texts, but mainly Exodus 20, where you just were, and Deuteronomy chapter 5. I don't have any slides, so you're going to have to use a Bible. Exodus 20, Deuteronomy 5. And this morning, I want to look at three questions. What is the Sabbath? And what did it mean for Israel? What makes it important to God? And does God still care about it? And if he does care about it, what does that mean to me? Okay. What is the Sabbath? In Exodus 20, 8 through 11, that's when you have that large chunk. First off, the Hebrew word for Shabbat has no theological meaning. It doesn't mean that God rested. It doesn't mean that God set aside as holy. It just means to rest or desist. It doesn't even mean 7, as some people think it does. Again, it is just rest. No matter what happens to this day in Israel's future, the initial attempt was just take a break, refresh. The day is the one portion of time that God makes holy. It is the day that God himself rests from the work that he has set out to do. Notice the command in chapter 20 alludes to Genesis and the reason behind the law. God worked 6 days and rests on the seventh. And though there's no word for Sabbath, the actual day of Sabbath, in Genesis, there is a word for rest. And it appears here in conjunction with the Sabbath. Exodus 31, though, you don't have to turn there. It's a bit more explicit in its command. On the seventh day, God ceased working. It's not just rest. God's not going to work. One author says, if Israel is to be God's people, they have to mirror God and set aside one day where they attend not to their own responsibilities and freedoms, but to God's ordering of life. This is not just a break. This is a day in honor of God because God ceased working on the seventh day. That's what his people will do as well. The day highlights God being unique by linking creation and God and rest together. Israel should understand that this God is not Pharaoh. God's kingship and his power are not demonstrated by coercion and bullying. God's power is demonstrated by sacrifice and kindness. God has not saved Israel to be his workforce. He has saved them out of love, and he has saved them and instructed them to build this new land and to settle there, not for his glory, but for their own enjoyment. Israel goes from having to work 2 or 3 jobs and work weekends to having to now work the traditional Monday through Friday schedule. And this is very noticeable given what they just left in Egypt. The idea of rest is not stressed so much in that Exodus 20, 10 Commandments. But it is stressed a lot more in Exodus chapter 23. 6 days do your work. On the 7th day, don't work, so that your ox and your donkey may rest, and so that the slave born in your household and the foreigner living among you may have rest and be refreshed. When you look at their work schedule from Egypt, that's all they've ever known. They never stopped working. Whenever Pharaoh opens his mouth, most of what he has to say has to do with this terrible schedule that Israel had to have. Lines like, why are you taking the people away from their work? Get back to your labors. You want them to stop working, Moses. Lines like, you shall no longer give the people straw to make bricks before. Let them go and gather straw for themselves, and you shall require the same quantity of bricks as they have made previously. Do not diminish it. They're just lazy. Why did you not finish the work that was required of you? You're just lazy. You are lazy people. Lazy. That is why you say, let us go and sacrifice to God. Get back to your work. For no straw will be given to you, and you shall deliver the same number of bricks. It's a hard life. The day should have provided some sort of stress relief for Israel. In Exodus 34, it highlights the sort of mentality behind the Sabbath. God isn't so much interested in peak seasons and deadlines as Pharaoh was. And to some extent, Israel shouldn't be either. The Sabbath was to be kept even during plowing season and harvest. There's no breaks. Well, there are breaks. But in God's schedule of that seventh day stop and desist, it's always to be happening no matter how important you think it is. The logical choice for Israel at this point would be to, if they have to take a break, then we'll just delegate the work. So we'll get the day off, but all of our foreigners and slaves living in our household, they're going to be the ones to take it up. And God says, no. Everybody has to stop. If Israel's identity is marked by this Sabbath, then anybody who comes into contact with Israel and those who choose to live in Israel, they're going to be blessed the exact same way. If I say the name Truett Cathy, do y'all know who that is? Some of y'all? Okay, it's founder of Chick-fil-A. So back in 1946, he decides to open up Chick-fil-A, and he decides working on Sunday is too tiring. I think it was back in when he first started, I wrote a date down here, 1940, well shoot, I've now lost the date. I think it was 1943. When he first began his business practices, he worked Monday through Saturday and thought, man, I'm just tired. I'm going to take a day off. And not just me. From here on out, beginning in 1946, every Chick-fil-A or business that I touch is going to have Sunday off for me, for the employees, for anybody who has touched Chick-fil-A. You're not going to be working on Sunday. There is a bit of modern-day Sabbath implementation here. Now, that sounds a lot more like, if you have the Deuteronomy chapter open in Deuteronomy 4, that version is a lot like what Truett is doing here. It emphasizes that the house owner gets to rest, and so should all the people working in the house and any foreigners living in Israel as well. In this version, there seems to be two different things happening. Number one, everybody gets to enjoy rest, and we don't delegate work. And number two, we are to keep in mind what God did for them in Egypt. They are not to treat people the way that they were treated under their old masters. They are to treat people in the way that God has treated them. So this idea of Sabbath is a reimagining of life away from coercion, away from bullying and competition, to this compassionate unity. Okay, Sabbath is certainly a gift, but there's more to it than just saying it's a gift. If that was all it was, then the penalty would not be as harsh as it is. Remember what the penalty was for breaking the Sabbath? Besides Joseph, anybody else remember it? You died. God says it is that important. If you break this Sabbath law, I'm going to kill you. Or they will kill you. You are to be put to death. It was so important to God that he, as Israel's king, wants them to learn how to manage their life. Being his people carries with it this unique status that requires living in a certain way. And Israel is not to adopt the ways of the people that they're going in, of the ways of Canaan. And that includes living like they did. They are to be holy as he is holy, and because the Sabbath is treated as separate and holy, that's the way Israel is going to treat it. Sabbath, therefore, becomes this identity marker for Israel. In Exodus 31, 12 through 17, God offers this day as a sign of covenant between himself and his people. And it's delivered, it's written in sort of the same covenant language you have with Noah back in Genesis. So by setting this day apart, Israel would acknowledge that Yahweh alone is their God. Therefore, you could say that by choosing to ignore this command could be seen as a rejection of God. Other nations had feasts and festivals like Israel had, but man, nobody had a day where everything just stopped. Israel is given this grace for them to demonstrate their dependence on God to provide for them in 6 days what they would need in 7, and unfortunately, they didn't want the gift. It was cool at first, but by the time you get to the end of the Old Testament, man, things have just fallen apart. The reason why is that the Sabbath is really counterintuitive. Not to trade on the Sabbath or sell on the Sabbath really hinders your ability to make money. In Isaiah 56, God sends blessings on anybody who will keep the Sabbath rather than treating it as an ordinary day like the neighbors did. God grants a Sabbath not for rest, but to demonstrate that there are more important things in life than just getting ahead. There's more important things than making money. The more important thing is trust me and reflect on me. Work like me. On the Sabbath day, getting ahead cannot be a concern. What should be of concern is participating in God's kingdom. Unfortunately, what started as a gift bled into this burden on Israel's life. When you get to Amos, who is one of the prophets, it talks about people hating the Sabbath because it gets in the way of their business practices. You come to find out that those business practices are cheating people out of money. Ezekiel talks about God giving a Sabbath between the people, and yet they just desecrated it. So, what about now? If it's such an important piece of Israel's history and identity and God's law, what do we do with it? Do we have to keep a Sabbath? What does it look like if we do? I think we can agree that the Sabbath was designed as a day to rest and stop your work. Unfortunately, it turned into this list of do's and don'ts, and we see some of that in Mark. Jesus or Paul does not ever condemn the Sabbath, but Jesus does tell us that this idea of restraining people and giving them this list of things they can and can't do, that's not what it was made for. What's that famous line Jesus said? The Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. So when we talk about work, well, I'll come back to that. This gets me to the final question. What does the Sabbath mean for us today? We've looked at this brief overview of Old Testament Sabbath, but I want to give you 3 points this morning in the form of questions that I would be asking if I were in your seat. Question number 1. It sounds like that you're saying, in order for me to be a good Christian, I have to keep a Sabbath. That is not what I'm saying at all. But I am saying is that because you are a Christian, it is important to consider your work life. If filling your time with work was a concern for God, I would say it's something that Christians should think about in their own life. Well, Christians do keep a Sabbath, right? Isn't Sunday our Sabbath? People argue that. It's a good point. I've thought about that. When you get to the Old Testament, you can see that there is toward people developing the Sabbath as a day of worship. So if Christians want to make Sunday their Sabbath day, I think that's fine. But here's the problem for me. I don't know how stressful your Sundays are, but mine are stressful. You talk about getting up in the morning. We've got to get up earlier, especially today. And y'all start later than Fairfax does, which is where I attend. So I'm thankful for that. But getting up early to then get dressed, to then get the kids ready, to then sit in traffic if there is any, then we have to get our coffee because we can't have the morning without our coffee, and we can't make it at home because it takes too long. So we have to go out to Starbucks. We have to get the kids here, then make the kids sit. We have to talk to people that we sometimes don't want to do. And that, to me, stresses me out. So we have now taken this day that's supposed to be restful and focused on God, and we've made it hard. It's a burden. So if we want to make Sunday our day of rest, but that's your Sunday, I feel like this is going in and out, so let me say it again. I think we've missed the point if we're making the day more than it has to be. So, the last question, what does that mean for me then? How do I do a Sabbath? I have no idea. I can't give you a good answer there. I think it's important that if we start thinking about this and how time works in our life, that we stick to the Sabbath basics. It was just designed as a day to step away from your work. Well, what is work? I don't know. It was never explained. The Pharisees tried to, but that didn't turn out well. God just says, step away from your work, refresh, and remember and reflect on me. I can give you an idea of what mine looks like. I've kept a Sabbath day since 2015. So here's a look into mine. 2015 is a long time. I don't work, so I don't massage. I don't write. I don't even get on social media at all. And my wife can attest to this too. I don't get on Facebook. I don't get on Instagram. I don't get on Snapchat. All social media is blocked for me on Saturdays. When I was working at Arlington, all the work I did was done Sunday through Friday. So any sermons I had to give or any classes I had to teach was all done before Saturday. Because Saturday, I'm not touching it. I would try to hold all phone calls of anybody that wanted work done on Saturday. Now, I would, for emergencies, yes, I'll take it. But the point of it was, I don't want to think about work on Saturday. I want to just dedicate it to family time, to meditation, to prayer, to reading if I can, and currently right now, Hogwarts Legacy. So that's mine. But I can't, Hogwarts Legacy is a game for anybody who doesn't know. It's a new Harry Potter game. But that's me. I can't tell you what it would be for you. My point this morning is not to get you to take a day off. If you think that's what I'm doing, that's not. I'm not saying take your Saturdays or Sundays off. No. The point this morning is I want you to think about where your time is. I want you to think about what's controlling your life, what is consuming you, if anything. The New Testament does not give any indication that the Sabbath should ever be dismissed or thought of as useless or out of date. And I don't get the impression that God's principles, the idea of his people not being consumed with work, have changed. This is certainly worth considering in light of our culture today. For the first time in the history of the world, we are literally connected 24/7. Our emails are connected. Our communication is connected. And if you don't respond at 3 a.m. when you get an email, you're going to hear about it. I hear stories of clients who have very stressful jobs who, that's true. If they get an email at 4 a.m., they better respond in 30 minutes. Ouch. Some of you may have that. I'm not saying anything negative. That's just, it's a lot. In a culture that is always communicating, always working, always going, the Sabbath reminds us that we worship a God who demanded that his people step back from that lifestyle. It is a day that we don't have to produce more. We don't have to sell more. We don't have to talk more. I don't have to answer more emails. We don't have to do anything that the world says that we need to do. So the question is your life consuming you? Because it shouldn't be. When something is consuming you and eating you alive, how in the world do you think about anything else? By stepping away from what consumes my attention during the week, I am encouraged to put my focus somewhere else. Talk about showing God to your neighbor, huh? That'll get you some eye raises and some questions. Why do you take Saturdays or Sundays off? If your answer is something to do with God, that's going to seem a little strange to them. You don't like money? You don't use that day to, grow your following? You don't use that day to advance your business? No, I don't. Because the God I worship has no desire for his people to be slaves to anything or anyone. We are not slaves to our culture. We are not slaves to our work. And so, we take a moment. It doesn't have to be a day. It's a one step at a time deal. For this morning, we take a moment. We take a portion of our week to walk away, to breathe. My goodness, to just refresh. I think if we're looking at Sabbath today and asking, what does it mean for us? I think that's where we start. We just use it as a way to refresh, to stop, and to remember that it is not our world or our success that we serve or that gives us value. It is our God, and it is our Lord Jesus. Let's all stand and sing.